Have you ever stopped to think about how much plastic surrounds us every day? It's pretty much everywhere. The bottle you drank this morning, the clothes that you're wearing, the packaging wrap around almost everything we buy, especially on Christmas. We all know those times. But we're familiar with the environmental concerns. Everyone is. Oceans filled with plastic waste, animals tangled in debris. It's a crisis that we can see. But what if I told you that the real problem isn't out there? That the real problem is inside of us? Good afternoon. My name is Eduardo, and today I'll be taking you deeper into a growing health risk hidden in plain sight. I'll be discussing microplastics, which are tiny fragments of plastics that are less than 5 millimeters in size, and fragments that aren't just polluting the ocean, but have entered the food we eat. That is right. Even right now, whatever you're eating, you have it. The air we breathe in, as well as we breathe. And as new research showed, even in our bodies. In the next few minutes, you'll learn how microplastics accumulate on our tissue, how they cause inflammation and oxidize stress, and how to research are monitoring these invisible threats. All of these are key things that we need to know. But because this issue isn't just about the environment anymore, it's now a public health challenge, one that affects each and every one of us. Let's start by defining what microplastics are. Microplastics, are also commonly known as MPS, are plastics fragments smaller than 5 millimeters. And they're about the sizes of a sesame seed or even smaller actually. Now these tiny pieces from when there are larger plastics break down over time due to sunlight, also friction, and also chemical reactions. Now the bigger question is, where do you find this? Where do they come from? Well, first of all, everyday items like your water bottles and food packaging, which essentially degrades over time. Now they also come from synthetic clothing fiber. Every time we wash clothes made from polyester and nylon, our tiny plastic fibers are released into the wastewater. And now third, from personal care products, like things like exfoliated scrub or certain toothpaste used to contaminate microbeads. But those are things that are now banned in many countries. Because of their size, microplastics are literally everywhere. In our oceans, where seafood ingests them, in the air, where we breathe indoors and outdoors, and even in the soil, meaning that they can make up their way into plants and crops. That's right. So how do they enter our bodies is the question that you may be asking yourself. Well, primarily there are 3 routes. The first one is ingestion, which is eating food or drinking water that contaminates microplastics. The second one is essentially inhalation, which means breathing in microplastic fibers in the dust. And now finally, the third one is possibly through skin contact. Though that's being still studied though. But there was a study showed in 2023 that compiled data from numerous studies showing that microplastics have already been found in the human body. Those are in blood, placenta, breast milk, and even feces. That leads to the bigger question, and that is, if they're everywhere, included inside of us, what exactly are they doing to our health? Now that we know that plastics are everywhere, let's talk about what happens once they're inside of us. Do they pass through us harmlessly, or do they still building up during time? That's exactly what research ought to set to answer. One study by Yang in 2021 looked at 2 groups: patients with inflammatory bowel diseases and healthy individuals. And their findings were very clear, I'll tell you that much. Patients with inflammatory bowel diseases had an average of 41.8 microplastic particles per gram on feces. And you may be asking about the healthy individuals. Well, they had about 20.0 particles per gram. That's nearly a 50% increase in people suffering from intestinal disorders. So why is this important? Well, I suggest 2 things. Either the damaging intestinals of inflammatory bowel diseases patients are absorbing or retaining more microplastics. No. Or microplastics themselves may be contributing to gut inflammation. These type of plastics found were very similar. You found polyesyl tetramine, which is also known as PET, which is used in bottle bottles that make up about 22 to 34%. And you have polyamide fibers likely from clothing, which accounts for 9 to 12%. But it's not just those individuals that are healthy issues that we worry about. There's another study by Suarez in 2019 that analyzed stool samples from eight healthy participants from around Europe and Asia. I know that's not a lot, but every single person tested positive. There was an average of 20 microplastic particles in every 10 grams of stool. Particles ranged from the size of 50 microns, which are the size of a human hair, to up to 500 microns, about the size of a grain of sand. This shows one key thing. Microplastics or accumulations isn't limited to the sick. It's happening in healthy individuals too. Which leaves us asking, how much plastics are we carrying and how much might this affect us over time? Now let's take a look at how microplastic move beyond our digestive gut. Suri, a study in 2023, reviewed 91 different studies, and what they found is very alarming. They detected microplastics in human blood, which means that these particles circulate through our entire body. They also found them in our urine, which shows that microplastic passes through the kidney and may affect our filter organs. And now they were present in breast milk, raising serious concerns about microplastic reaching infants during their first month of life. Even more concerning, they were found in placenta tissue. One study by Amrad in 2022 took a closer look at this. They analyzed placentas from women with a percentage complicated with fetal restrictions. They discovered that 2 to 38 microplastic particles per placenta, was that over half of these particles were made of polystyrene and polyrene, which are common plastics used in food, packaging, and consumer products. And importantly, more than 60% of these particles were smaller than 10 microns. They were tiny enough to cross into the fetal tissue. The research found a direct link, which higher microplastic levels were associated with smaller newborn size measures. Now think about that. Microplastics are not only reaching adults, but could be affecting fetal development. Question becomes, if microplastics can enter bloodstream and placenta, how might they impact health outcomes across a person's entire life? Microplastics don't just sit harmlessly in our gut. They actively harm us by breaking down the gut's protective barrier, a layer that is meant to control what enters the bloodstream. When the barrier is essentially weakened, harmful substance leaked into the circulation, and this condition is commonly referred to as a leaky gut. And what happens is that the immune system is on a high alert, a trigger inflammation of response, that something's not there, that something's not supposed to be there. Now, it doesn't just stop there. Microplastics disrupt the whole balance of good and bad bacteria in the gut that creates dysbiosis, which is the imbalance of bacteria. Now, the beneficial bacteria like Lactobacillus is in a decline. Now, that essentially means that harmful species will essentially flourish, and that would essentially aggravate the inflammation. On a one key factor is that inflammation is an increased production of cytokines, which essentially is molecules that are driven their immune response. The studies have shown higher levels of interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, both strongly linked to a chronic inflammation disease. Even more concerning, microplastics act as expungives that absorb toxic substances like heavy metals that are like lead and cadmium, and also known as polyalkylamine hybrids, which are known as PATH, that are linked to cancer. You also have PCBs, which restrict hormones and immune functions, and these toxins worsen the inflammatory and disrupt hormones have been tied all together that creates cancer and cardiovascular diseases. Over the time, the toxic combination such as gut damage, dysbiosis, inflammation, and chemical exposure increase the risk of chronic conditions like inflammatory bowel disease, heart disease, and metabolic disorders. That raises the real concern of how much long-term damage might be silently building inside of us due to microplastic exposure. To better understand how microplastic affect us, scientists often turn to animal models. These control studies allow research to track how microplastic behave inside living organisms. One study by Kwan in 2019 used zebra fishes, chose for the genetic similarities to humans and transparent bodies. They used a 5 micron polyester microplastic concentration of 50 to 500 microorganisms and over 21 days, mimicking chronic exposure. Now, this essentially showed levels of inflammatory markers that essentially was tied to inflammatory diseases in humans. There was another study in 2017 exposed mice to microplastic size by 5 microns and 20 microns, which essentially smaller particles that penetrate deeper and essentially are accumulating in the liver, kidney, and intestines. And what they observed was that factors like MDA, markers of lipid damage, and also AOBG, markers of DNA damage, were also noted. And they noted about altered glucose, cholesterol, and triglyceride levels. There's a similar to patterns seen in the condition like insulin-resistant and cardiovascular diseases. Together, these studies underlines a key point. Prolonged plastic exposure doesn't just stay in the gut. It leads to systematic inflammation, oxidative damage, and metabolic stress. These are some of my key statistics of microplastic exposure. As we see, I talked about it before. These are some things that I talked about: 40.8 micrograms in the feces. I talked about 2 to 38 microplastics per placenta. Those are things that I have talked about in my previous slides. So how do microplastics actually measure how much the microplastics we are exposed to? The answer is biomonitoring, analyzing biological samples like feces, blood, or urine to detect microplastics accumulated in the body. Microplastics, fetal analysis has become one of the key tools because it's non-invasive and it shows direct ingestions of levels. I talked about before about a study of Jiang in 2021 that compared 2 fetal samples from people with inflammatory bowel diseases and also from healthy individuals. And as well as another example that we talked about, SWOT, 2019, that looked at 8 healthy people from Europe and Asia. And every single person tested positive for microplastics. The test results doesn't tell us whether or not they're healthy or not. They all were being exposed. However, one problem research faces is inconsistency. Sudi, in 2023, stressed that without standardizing global monitoring protocols, it's hard to compare results or understand the full picture. If every human sample so far contains microplastics, how much more are we accumulating over time? Now, what we have covered today has been very essential. We talked about the fact that microplastics are in water, food, and also in the air we breathe. But essentially, we also said that they don't just pass through, they stay with us. Meaning that they're in the blood, meaning placenta, and also breast milks. Now, we have talked about the fact that they also do damage gut, and that create chronic inflammation and oxidative stress. And when we looked at animal studies that show microplastics, they spread to vital organs that cause systematic metabolic destruction. And when we talked about biomonitoring studies that confirm microplastics are essentially every single person that have tested so far has been positive. This is not longer a simply environment problem anymore. It's actually a serious public health concern that affects everybody globally. To face this challenge, we need more research that standardize biomonitoring protocols and policies aimed at reducing microplastic exposure. If microplastics are already inside of everybody one of us, the question becomes, what would long-term impact be if we don't act now? Thank you very much for everybody.